This episode brought to you by Cafe Imports, Minneapolis-based importers of fine specialty green coffees. Independently owned and operated since 1993, Cafe Imports has been dedicated to decreasing its impact on the earth through renewable energy, carbon neutrality, and by supporting conservational efforts in places where quality coffee is grown and also where quality coffee is consumed. Where does your coffee come from? Welcome to the Lake Superior Podcast. I'm Walt Lindelof.
And I'm Frida Wara. We are made stronger by story, and there's no better source than the continent's largest body of fresh water, Lake Superior.
So join us as we highlight the 5 national parks that ring this greatest of the Great Lakes, meet the people, tour the places, and learn about the projects that make these parks and body of water so remarkable.
This podcast made possible with the support of the National Parks of Lake Superior Foundation and Media Brew Communications.
I'm Walt Lindelof.
And I'm Frida Wara.
Welcome once again to the Lake Superior Podcast. And Frida, today we have another a photographer, a master at his creative art of capturing the image. And you've been able to get a little more information together about David Guttenfelder.
Absolutely, Walt. So first of all, how many countries have you been to?
Me?
Yeah.
5, maybe?
Yeah.
Something like that.
Israel?
No.
India?
I can't say I have.
Ivory Coast?
No.
North Korea?
No, it hasn't been on my travel list.
Can you imagine traveling the world, seeing somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 countries?
Maybe.
Like really seeing them and going to North Korea for dozens of times. And not only that, but capturing the images, telling the story with a lens. And that's what David has done. He's 8-time World Press Photo Award winner, 7-time finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. His North Korean photo, as not just one, he's had many, but one of them was named among Time Magazine's 100 most influential photographs ever taken.
Wow.
And he's not only a National Geographic photographer, has been for about a dozen years, and done 20 assignments with them, but he's also labeled a National Geographic explorer. So that really catches my attention. And to know that he now is shining that lens on our Lake Superior.
That's right. He is going to be doing some traveling to the Apostle Islands. We welcome David Guttenfelder to the podcast. Good day, David.
Good day. Thank you for having me.
Wow, this is really something. Now, Frida is running this entire list of your accolades and everything, but I got to ask you right off the bat, what is it that makes you just do this? What is it that you like about having the ability to capture a moment and tell a story with your camera and getting that image?
Well, I think I started in photography just as an excuse for wanting to see any and all of the places that Frida mentioned, sort of have a front row seat to seeing the world with my own eyes, and photography was my purpose and my price of admission, I guess, for all those things. But it became much more than that over the years, and photography has really just led me throughout my life for the last 25 years.
Where are you from originally, if I may ask?
I grew up in Iowa, a farm in central Iowa, but I have connections to Wisconsin, in-laws, and it's where I met my wife. So Wisconsin is, where I consider to be my sort of U.S. home. And, we lived outside of the United States for over 20 years, but Three Lakes, Wisconsin was always my mailing address and a bit of an anchor for me and my family, and where we always would come back to. So I guess I consider myself a Wisconsinner.
David, was your family big travelers?
No. In fact, growing up in rural Iowa, I didn't know anyone who had traveled anywhere. I didn't know anyone who owned a passport. And I was an adult, 19 years old, I think, the first time I traveled anywhere, the first time I saw the ocean or got into an airplane. So I sometimes think that if I had been born someplace, a little more exciting than soybean fields of Iowa. I might not have traveled so far, but I always wanted to go as far away as I possibly could.
Not only just far away, but like, let's talk at the end of the road.
Yeah.
I don't even know anyone else in my life that's been spent as much time as you have in North Korea with these assignments. How did all of this happen?
I didn't know that it would happen either. I had an opportunity when I was in university to go on a foreign exchange study program. I went to the offices there, and they said, you can go to Germany or Italy. And I said, what about, something a little further afield? And they said that there was an opportunity in Tanzania. So that was the first place that I traveled. I went there as a student. I was studying Swahili language. I went there thinking that I would, just spend a few months as a student. And that really just became ever since, the next 30 years of my life.
That was your first time out of the U.S. borders, was to Tanzania?
Yeah, and I lived there for a year and a half. I spoke only Swahili in the year that I was there. It was a time in your life when, your only job is to to learn and just to be as, wide open as you possibly can. And, I feel like that was the beginning of, and everything that I sort of draw on since came from that year and a half experience as a student, where I was just going home every weekend with my Tanzanian college friends and learning to live in another culture, speak another language, step outside of your own experience and into somebody else's experience, and have empathy and patience. And it's where I learned to be a storyteller, because that's the first time I started really taking photographs.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So we're talking with David Guttenfelder today, who is a photographer, world-traveling, world-renowned photographer as well. David, about that, I'm hearing that you had an inherent sense of getting out and experiencing different people's different cultures just for the sake of learning from them. How did that influence how you take a photo? How did that influence with the story that you're trying to tell by capturing that moment?
Well, I think that's what it's all about for me. And there's lots of different kinds of photography and photographers. For me, it's about connections to people. And so even if it's a culture that's very foreign or a national park, ultimately for me, it's about the people and the stories, telling other people's stories and the connections that you can make between people. And the camera not only, helps you tell those stories or capture those stories, but it's kind of a conduit to it's the excuse to, enter into people's lives. Mm-hmm. And it's a place for your curiosity. And so the camera helps you make friends and tell their stories.
Tell us a little bit about now this project. You're doing some work with the Apostle Islands, or at the Apostle Islands on Lake Superior. Tell us a little bit about this particular project and what you're hoping to accomplish with it.
It's not North Korea.
Yeah.
David, we're going to be speaking all the same language, and you're not going to be too far from home. What's the draw?
Well, it's true. I spent most of my career traveling to very far away places. I even thought that that's what I had to do to be a storyteller, a National Geographic photographer. But, as it turns out, we have very important, equally important places that we cherish in our own backyards. And so I can't say that I expected to do a story from my native Wisconsin or about the Apostle Islands, but I'm really grateful that I'm given the chance to do that. I think last year we were all kind of stuck inside with the pandemic, and it forced us to look inward and to think about what's important and what responsibilities we have to our own families, communities, and to really kind of go and explore what's in our own backyards. And that's what this feels like to me, a chance to do that, a chance to do the kind of homecoming story, something about where I, where my family and I are connected to and where I grew up. I admit, even with the Wisconsin connection, I didn't know much about the Apostle Islands, and I hadn't been there until last year. And the National Parks of Lake Superior Foundation and Tom Irvine reached out to me and said, "What do you think?" And we went up there just as a kind of like, I guess, a little recce trip to see, so that I could learn a little bit of something about it and take a few photographs. And, what Tom told me was true, which is that I fell really quickly in love with the place. How complicated it is, the many, many layers of history, native and Western history, the geology, geography, the wildlife. And it's a place to do something that I've always loved, which is kayaking.
And I feel so fortunate that I get to join you on this trip and just listening, because of course there's a sanctity to me about Lake Superior and knowing just what those islands, and we always call them the Caribbean of Lake Superior. It's a little bit of an oxymoron to use Caribbean, but when you look at the blue, as you've seen, the blues of those islands and certainly of the history there, but you're going to be traveling by kayak. We're going to be traveling by. How does that make your job easier or more difficult?
Well, I think I probably made it a little harder. But, ultimately I'm there to tell a story about what's unique about each of the 21 islands. And, I guess it wouldn't have mattered how I got to each of the islands. But, I know from experience that the best way to explore a place and tell a story is to kind of travel slowly. And to be as low to the ground or the water as possible. So I added this kind of, adventure and story, which is 21 islands in 21 days that we're going to try and do. But that's just getting from place to place. And, I'll be telling a bit of that story, the story of our adventure, but the real storytelling will be what I find on each island. And so in a way, after 15 miles on open water in hopefully good weather, I'll arrive at an island, and that is kind of the beginning of my day. And we may also have to then hike 10 miles and photograph in the right light and the right spot. So I don't really know for sure if I know what kind of how big of a bite I've taken.
Well, that's the thing, though. What I'm hearing, and we're talking with David Guttenfelder today, who is photographer, National Geographic photographer, and explorer, about work that he's going to be doing on the Apostle Islands here in Lake Superior. But what I'm hearing, David, from just speaking with you, is you sound like a very a calm, almost methodical kind of person. And I have to wonder, how does that work in terms of you getting your photos? Because there's obviously some thought. You got to figure out where you're going to be, try to catch it. But then really also the magical ones are catching that lightning in a bottle. How do you, how does your personal approach to it work? I mean, you think it all out, place it out as best as you can, or you just kind of try to be in the right place at the right time?
Well, I think it takes a lot of, especially for a National Geographic story, which, mercifully they give us a lot of time and the chance to dig, deeper than we would if it was a different magazine or newspaper. So it takes a lot of planning, takes a lot of focus, not only in the logistics of a trip and storytelling, but in the sort of figuring out in advance what your priorities are, what the story that you want to tell, sort of chapters, as it were. Mm-hmm. But then I also like to just add a kind of adventure to it, or a road trip, or a spine to it, because that's where you get the pictures that you would never have expected, the serendipitous moments, the things that you can't plan for. And then it's a matter of, being personally ready and experienced to sort of react to those things. And I mean, I think that we've planned every single day of this trip. And I have a long sort of shot list, so to speak, of things that I hope to photograph on each island. But my guess is that between the weather and the big mean lake and life and everything else, that all of that will probably, go out the window, and I'll have to just react to whatever we find.
And that reaction is going to be so important, because in the last 24 hours, Walt and I can attest that the lake has totally flipped.
Yeah.
Yesterday being in the high 80s, today barely into the 60s, and a chop coming and winds out there. But that's also the story. I mean, you've been there since the fall, and David, you got a chance to make a trip in the winter too, didn't you?
Yeah, we went earlier this year in the winter. It wasn't the ideal conditions that the Apostle Islands are known for, the ice caves and so forth. But it was my first chance to see it in winter, and we visited some of the places that I had been, in the fall, and they certainly looked different, felt different.
What has there been any surprises for you as you've, certainly when you can look at a map, and then when you actually get boots on the ground, it's a whole different feeling. But any surprises that you weren't expecting? You're somebody with such your suitcase has a lot of experience in it.
Well, I think this is a little bit of a different and unusual kind of trip or expedition for me. I don't know that I was surprised, but I guess I would say what has impressed me the most about the Apostle Islands and in every opportunity I've had so far to visit is how complex it is in terms of there's so many different perspectives. There's 21 islands, and each one is so dramatically different in what they have to, offer and reveal about themselves. And I've met so many people who are, have been lifelong lovers of the Apostle Islands and know them so deeply. So it's kind of humbling, honestly. It's really humbling. I've met people who have photographed there for much of their lives. I've met people who have devoted their professional life to the Apostle Islands as park rangers, as historians. I've met, native elders and their profound connection. So I feel like that's also a bit of a kind of humbling responsibility to live up to when I'm going there, when it's really, I'm a newbie.
Well, it doesn't sound to me, David, like there's going to be a shortage of stories to try to tell, which I think is probably got to be exciting for you as a photographer to get in there, to have a chance to really have a go at it.
Yeah, and I'm kind of a generalist as a photographer. So we have, at National Geographic especially, we have people who are very, focused on wildlife or even, one species of, there's a photographer who's devoted his entire life to photographing bees. So I'm more of a generalist. I focus on people and, the sort of context that they live in and how they sort of the confluence and conflict people have with the natural world. And so, in a way, everything is a photograph for me, and the Apostle Islands just offers just so much.
What is this time frame that you're doing? You guys are going here pretty soon and then be back and so on. Because I'm kind of wondering, David, if we could have a chance at some point to talk with you after this is all over to find a little bit more of your perspective. But what you're getting going here in first part of August, correct?
That's right. I mean, I started early last year, and I've been going back and forth. When I can, kind of focusing on some of the more planned activities. I went out with Park Service biologists to see their really important work around endangered plovers. I've been out with people from the Red Cliff Band of the Chippewa who have been doing all kinds of interesting things. I've slept on a couple of the islands. I've tried to do as much work as possible in advance, and then afterwards that will continue. And this is a long-term project that'll take us through most of this year. This kayaking trip is 3 weeks, starts August 3rd, and so we finish by the end of August. And I'll be soggy and glad to talk to you again after that.
Let's hope we're only wet and not cold. I think I shared that it seems like on August 15th, the lake changes just significantly. And all of a sudden, the winds come. And I always believe the season never changes unless the winds come. And that seems to be what brings in the fall weather. But that also can mean that you get that Indian summer and it's glorious. And I can't imagine. Truthfully, there's no better time, David. As someone who's lived on the lake for most of my life, it is the warmest I have ever felt the water.
Right now,
yeah, it's amazing. So
it should be a good trip for you guys.
We're hoping so. David, let's just get to, for a second, about technically, is all your gear going to fit in your boat? Do you need some hatch space?
Well, I hopefully won't be leaning on my travel partners too much, but I'm in the process of doing that now, and I'm not as experienced as you or any of the other people on our trip on Lake Superior, and so I'm learning as I'm learning right now, and so I've got all of my gear, and I'm packing it in my dry bags, and I'm seeing what fits where, and distributing the weight, and I've been sort of training, putting 10 or 20 miles a day in my boat, and trying to do it now with my equipment, which is, will be camping equipment, of course, all the kayaking equipment, and then all of the photography equipment, which includes, tons of batteries and power packs and storage devices so that I can have 3 copies of the pictures. So if I go in the drink, I won't lose, all of the work that I had done up to that point. So there's a lot of stuff, and it's a puzzle I'm trying to put together right now and learn from before we launch.
And it's got to stay dry. That's what I keep thinking. And in my head, I'm also thinking, does he have a tripod? Because sometimes when we're in a kayak trip, you got to make sure your tent poles aren't very long. So just how you wiggle some of that into these spaces is tricky. But most of all, I'm just thinking about keeping that equipment dry.
Yeah, every trip has its unique challenges, and this one, of course, is, I guess, space. And but I'm not carrying on my back, which I've done before, and water, and keeping everything dry. Fortunately, I'm pretty basic photographer in a sense. I watch fellow National Geographic photographers, and I'll see her at the airport, and with 25 cases or 50 cases and bags and scuba gear and all these things, and I'm kind of amazed because I'm the kind of photographer that can fit everything under the seat in front of me on the plane.
Wow!
And so that'll probably serve me well on this trip. I'll have essentially one camera and one lens, which I'll be using for most of the trip.
We're talking with David Guttenfelder today. He is a photographer, National Geographic photographer, explorer, also nominated and award-winning photographer, about a kayaking trip to the Apostle Islands here on Lake Superior. It sounds like you've kind of got a good idea on this, David, but I'm curious if people want to maybe see some of your work, maybe they want to see some of the stuff that you've done. Do you have a website, Instagram account, anything like that you want to make sure people know about so they can see not only some of the work that you may be posting as this goes on, but other things that you have had the opportunity to capture?
Sure. I do have my website, which is just my first and last name, davidguttenfelder.com, and that's a pretty comprehensive collection of all of the tall tales that I've told that Frida mentioned at the beginning of this. And then social media has been a really amazing kind of change in our business, and I think for everybody, is that we all have, in our phone, we have our own little magazine. And, National Geographic takes a long time before it finally lands in your front doorstep in paper format. But along the way, we'll be posting pictures on my personal Instagram, which is at D Guttenfelder, and on the National Geographic Instagram, which is at NatGeo. And I think there's another account which we call Nat Geo in the Field, and that's a National Geographic Instagram account, which kind of shows the backstory and the making of the ropes and pulleys behind the stage, where I can be posting some of the sort of backstory of our trip.
David Guttenfelder has been with us today on the Lake Superior podcast. And David, you're going out with Frida for these 3 weeks on this trip. It's going to be a great adventure. I personally am looking forward to hearing from you about it. I know I'll hear all about it from Frida. I know that. But your perspective on it, especially with the experiences that you've had. And I do want to thank you for joining us here today on the podcast.
Thank you both very much, and looking forward to it.
That's David Guttenfelder, who is a National Geographic photographer, National Geographic explorer. He is award-nominated and award-winning. And, Frida, you're going out for 3 weeks with this guy. I can see you got goosebumps on there right now, because this is not only just an adventure, which, of course, is great that you guys are doing this, but you're really going to document this. And it's not even just I heard this in the conversation with David. It's not just going out and taking pictures of this while you're out there. There's also some scientific aspects to it. There's some cultural and historic aspects to it. That's got to be an added factor for you too.
I am just overwhelmed. And, when we got a chance to remember when we spoke with David Cooper, and he said, as the archaeologist on the islands and in the park, he would never run out of story material. And that's what I think David has already touched on so many aspects. And there'll also be a writer along. Her name is Stephanie Pearson. And this is slated for the December issue of National Geo. So it's really exciting to know there's a deadline. We're coming back and it's got to get in the can and get together. But I'm really, focusing on the Midwest, looking at Lake Superior, understanding, do we want to draw more attention to our beautiful big blue out there? Well, to let the world know how really special this place is.
And the other thing is what you're doing on this trip, and the writer and David and everyone is doing on this trip, is it's taking them there when they can't make the trip. And that's the important part. That's what we hope that we try to do here every time we get together for this podcast. And we do want to thank you all for listening for another episode of it. Again, that was David Guttenfelder, a photographer, National Geographic photographer. And you're saying that December issue of National Geographic?
Your Christmas present. I'll get you a copy. I'll sign it for you.
Well, we do want to thank you all for joining us today for another edition of the Lake Superior podcast. I'm Walt Lindelof.
I'm Frida Wara. Thank you so much for joining us and listening in. The National Parks of Lake Superior Foundation, NPLSF, is the only official nonprofit 501c3 fundraising partner of the National Park Service for all 5 U.S. national park sites on Lake Superior.
To learn more about NPLSF projects and programs, you can visit the website at nplsf.org or friend them on Facebook.
I'm Frida Wara.
And I'm Walt Lindelof. Thanks for listening to the Lake Superior podcast.
This podcast made possible with the support of the National Parks of Lake Superior Foundation and Media Brew Communications.
This episode brought to you by Cafe Imports, Minneapolis-based importers of fine specialty green coffees. Independently owned and operated since 1993, Cafe Imports has been dedicated to decreasing its impact on the earth through renewable energy, carbon neutrality, and by supporting conservational efforts in places where quality coffee is grown and also where quality coffee is consumed. Where does your coffee come from?